We love to call it genius, the perfect sound, the perfect show, the greatest live act rock and roll ever put on a stage, a man and a woman so electric together that America decided they had to be a love story too. But nobody paid more for that perfection than the woman singing lead, and she didn't pay in sweat. She paid in black eyes she lost count of, in third-degree burns, in 16 years of what she would one day call a life of death, already gone on the inside, while the whole world screamed her name. This was never a love story. It was a story about control, about a man who had to own every note, every dollar, every person in the room, including the biggest voice in America, who was slowly starting to understand that, on paper, she belonged to him. But monsters don't get born on a stage, in the lights, in the applause. They get made years earlier, in the dirt. So before we get to the night she runs across a Dallas freeway with blood on her face and 36 cents in her pocket, before we get to the escape, we have to go back to the two broken children who grew up to become Ike and Tina Turner. Because you cannot understand how this ended until you see how each of them began. And I'll tell you right now, what she built after she finally got out is even harder to believe than what she survived to get there. Here's what America got wrong from the very first note. The name up on the marquee was Tina Turner. The voice was Tina Turner. The legs, the fire, the growl that could strip paint, all Tina Turner. But Tina Turner wasn't a woman. Not legally. It was a brand, and she didn't own a piece of it. The man she married built that name on purpose. He registered it, locked it down like you would lock down a company logo, for one specific reason. So that if she ever tried to walk, he could zip another singer into her dress, send her out under the same name, and keep the money coming. The star of the show was, on paper, staff. Replaceable staff. That's not me being dramatic. That was a decision he made before most of the country ever heard her sing a single word. Hold on to that. The name. Because 13 years down the road, that exact name, the cage he built to keep her, becomes the only thing that saves her. So keep that name in your back pocket. Because the girl it was built to trap started life with no name worth stealing, no money, and no reason to believe the world had anything good waiting for her. And that's where every monster and every miracle in this story begins. Not in the lights, but down in the dirt. She was born Anna Mae Bullock on November 26, 1939, in Brownsville, Tennessee. Except home was even smaller than Brownsville. Home was a speck of a place called Nutbush, a church, a store, and a whole lot of cotton in between. Her father, Floyd, worked as an overseer of the sharecroppers out at a place called Poindexter Farm. Her mother was named Zelma. And whatever you're picturing when I say sharecropper Tennessee in the 1940s, the heat, the long rows, the hands raw by noon, she was in it. She picked cotton alongside her family before she was old enough to understand what poverty even was. On Sundays, she sang in the choir at the Little Baptist Church up the road. And by every account, even then, something happened in that room when she opened her mouth. The voice was already there. Nobody had a name for it yet. But there was a wound underneath the singing, and it went deep. In 1950, when Anna Mae was 11 years old, her mother left. No warning, no goodbye. Zelma packed up and went to St. Louis. And just like that, she was gone. 2 years later, her father remarried and moved to Detroit. And the girls got handed off to their grandmother. Anna Mae would say for the rest of her life that she grew up feeling like a child nobody actually wanted. Now, I want to be careful here. That's her telling it, decades later, in her own words. We can't climb inside a mother's head 50 years after the fact and prove what she felt. But you don't have to. Because a kid who watches one parent drive away and then watches the other one build a new family somewhere else learns a lesson early. Love leaves. Love doesn't stay. Hold that thought, because it explains almost everything that comes next. The only thing that ever quieted that ache was singing, and singing was about to walk her straight into the most dangerous room she'd ever enter. Because you can't understand what happened to her without understanding the man on the other side of it. His name was Ike Turner, and his story starts a few hundred miles south, in Clarksdale, Mississippi, deep Delta country, on November 5th, 1931. Even the name is complicated. Most of the world knew him as Z.R. Luster Turner Jr., but he told a story, years later, about applying for his first passport and discovering the government had him down as something else entirely, Ike Wister Turner. Both his parents were dead by then. There was nobody left to ask, so the man who trademarked another person's name couldn't say for certain what his own real name was. He grew up poor in a way that's hard to describe to people who never saw the Jim Crow South. He quit school in the 8th grade. He ran the elevator at a hotel in Clarksdale, and that hotel happened to house a radio station, which is where a hungry, sharp-eyed kid talked his way behind the microphone and became a young disc jockey. He learned boogie-woogie piano off a local blues legend named Pine Top Perkins, practically begging the man to teach him the real stuff, instead of the polite lessons his mother wanted. And there was violence in his childhood, too. He said he watched his own father get beaten nearly to death by a white mob and never fully recover. Some historians who studied the Delta push back on that version, saying his father actually died in an industrial accident. And even the age Ike gives keeps changing depending on who's asking. So which is true? The record can't settle it, and I'm not going to pretend it can. But here's what matters. Ike grew up believing the world was a place where the powerful took what they wanted and the weak got dragged off and kicked to pieces. He didn't want to be the one who got dragged off, ever again. In 1951, he cut a record that people still argue about in music history classes. A raw, roaring thing about a car, recorded in Memphis. On the label it says Jackie Brinston and his Delta Cats. But that was Ike's band, his arrangement, his sound. You've probably heard it called the first rock and roll record ever made. Careful with that one. Historians have gone back and forth for decades, and honestly, there's no clean answer. Rock didn't get born on one day. But a contender? Absolutely. It hit #1 on the rhythm and blues charts, and here's the detail that tells you who Ike was going to be. For that record, a record that sold something like 500,000 copies, the band members each got paid $20. The singer Brinston signed his rights away for $910 and watched it become a piece of history he didn't own. Ike watched all of it, and Ike learned exactly the wrong lesson from it. Never again be the man who doesn't own the paper. 2 wounded people on a collision course. One who believed love always leaves. One who believed the only safety is control. And in a nightclub in East St. Louis, they were about to meet. She saw him before he ever saw her. Sometime around 1956, a teenage Anna Mae started tagging along to a club across the river in East St. Louis, Illinois, where Ike Turner and his band tore the place apart night after night. She wanted to sing with him so badly she could taste it. She asked. He brushed her off. She asked again, brushed off again. To Ike, she was just another girl in the crowd. Then one night, during a break between sets, she got hold of a microphone that a drummer had left sitting there, and she started to sing. B.B. King, and the whole room turned around. I want to stop on this because it's one of the great myths of this whole story, and it's backwards. For decades, people said Ike Turner discovered Tina Turner, like she was a diamond he spotted in the dirt. That's not what happened. Nobody discovered her. She grabbed the microphone off a drum kit and forced a room full of strangers and a man who'd been ignoring her for weeks to finally hear her. She discovered herself. He just realized, in that instant, what he was standing next to. And what did he do with that realization? He put her to work. First, she cut her first record in 1958 under a little stage name, Little Ann. Then, in 1960, came the moment that changed both their lives, and it happened almost by accident. Ike had written a song called A Fool in Love, and it was meant for a male singer who simply didn't show up to the session. Anna Mae stepped in to sing the demo. That demo was so good the record label refused to recut it with anyone else. The label president heard that voice, put real money on the table, and insisted she stay on the record. It came out that July, climbed to #2 on the rhythm and blues chart, and cracked the pop top 30, and it became their first million seller. And right there, before the country even had a chance to fall in love with her, Ike made his move. He renamed her. Anna Mae Bullock became Tina Turner. And quietly, without her fully grasping what it meant, he registered that name as his property. She thought she was getting a stage name. She was getting a leash. For a while, though, and this matters because it's why she stayed as long as she did, it worked. God, did it work. Through the 60s, they built an act unlike anything else on the road. Ike ran it like a general. The band, the arrangements, the choreography, a rotating troupe of dancing backup singers, more than 50 different women passing through that role over the years. There was even a stretch where a young, unknown guitar player named Jimi Hendrix stood in the band before the world knew who he was. And out front of all of it was her. Sweat flying, dress soaked through, that voice going from a whisper to a scream and back again, giving audiences something that felt less like a concert and more like a storm you got caught in. In 1966, a famous producer took them into the studio to make what he thought would be his masterpiece, a huge, towering wall of sound built around her voice. Ike, notably, was paid a good chunk of money to stay away from those sessions entirely. The record they made is now considered one of the greatest ever cut. And in America, it flopped. It stalled out at number 88. But across the ocean, in the United Kingdom, that same record shot to number 3 and made her a star on a whole other continent. Same voice, same song, two completely different verdicts. That gap, adored over there, ignored at home, would shape the rest of her career. Then, in 1971, they took a song by another band, a song about a riverboat, and did something nobody expected. They started it slow, tender, almost sweet, and then they set it on fire. That slow to fast, nice and easy, then nice and rough version became the definitive one, the one your parents danced to, the one that's still playing in some diner somewhere right now. It hit number 4 on the pop chart, and it won them a Grammy in early 1972, the only competitive Grammy the two of them would ever win together. All told, as a duo, they sold well over 10 million records, and here's where her story does the thing that makes her different from almost every other music legend of her era. She crossed over. In 1975, a wild, druggy rock opera film came calling, and Tina Turner made her acting debut in it. Her role? A character called the Acid Queen, a drug-dealing woman who lures in a broken, helpless boy and doses him into oblivion. A caged, dangerous, trapped figure. Critics couldn't take their eyes off her. She said later that at first she didn't even want the part, didn't want to play a woman like that, but that the challenge of it, the drama of it, that's what acting was all about. Sit with the timing of that for a second. In 1975, Tina Turner walked onto a film set and gave a mesmerizing performance as a woman trapped in a life she couldn't escape. And then the camera stopped, and she went home to a man who, by her own account, was doing something not so different to her. Subscribe now, before we go any further, because what she finally does to get out of that house is one of the most quietly terrifying escapes in the history of American music. And I want you to see every second of it coming. I've been careful with you so far, and I'm going to stay careful, because this is the part where a lot of storytellers get sloppy, and this woman deserves better than sloppy. Almost everything we know about what happened inside that marriage comes from her. From the book she wrote in 1986, from a memoir she released in 2018, from a Raw magazine interview she gave back in December of 1981, and from a documentary she took part in near the end of her life. This is her testimony. And Ike, when he was alive, disputed pieces of it. So I'll tell you what she said, I'll tell you what he said back, and I'll let you weigh it, because that's the honest way to do this. The way she told it, the abuse started almost at the beginning. She said that after that very first hit session, over something small, he hit her in the head with a wooden shoe stretcher, a hard tool, swung at a person, and that it never really stopped after that. She said she couldn't remember a single stretch of the marriage when she didn't have a black eye. In her later memoir, she described him throwing scalding coffee in her face and giving her third-degree burns. And in that magazine interview, decades before it was fashionable to talk about any of this, she said something that stops me cold every time. She said she'd been living a life of death, that she didn't fear him killing her if she left, because inside she was already dead. Underneath it all, there was cocaine. By his own admission, Ike spent close to 2 decades on it, freebasing, staying up for days, the paranoia and the rage feeding each other. He said he started using just to stay awake through the endless touring. Whatever it started as, it became the weather system the whole household lived under. And I need to mention one more thing, gently. Around 1968, at a low point on the road, Tina attempted to take her own life. She survived. I'm not going to give you the details of how, and I'd ask you not to go looking for them, because that's not what any of this is for. What matters is the desperation the attempt reveals, a woman so trapped that ending it felt like the only door left. Now, Ike, in his own book in 1999, he admitted he had hit her. He didn't fully deny it. He once told a St. Louis newspaper that the only thing he could say, and he'd only say it to her, was that he was sorry, that he couldn't undo yesterday, but he also fought bitterly against specific stories, against the way it all got portrayed, and he insisted to the end that it was a movie, not the marriage, that destroyed his life. He even disputed her account of their final fight. He claimed she picked that fight on purpose, to manufacture a reason to leave before a new contract got signed. I can't tell you what happened in that car. Neither could anyone but the two of them. But I can tell you exactly what she did next. And what she did next is the whole ball game. So here we are, back on that highway in Dallas. It's July 1976. The review has flown into town for a show. And on the way to the hotel, the way she always told it, something in the car goes wrong. And he beats her again. But this time, for the first time in 16 years, she fights back. She hits him back. All the way to the room, she keeps up a front, acts normal, gets him fed, waits. And she waits. She sits on the edge of that hotel bed while the man who's controlled every dollar and every decision of her adult life finally falls asleep. She doesn't cry out. She doesn't call anyone. She just waits for the breathing to go slow and steady. Then she gets up and she walks out the door with what's in her pockets. 36 cents, a gas card. That's the detail she repeated for the rest of her life, and it stuck to the story ever since. 36 cents and a mobile card, the sum total of what the biggest female star in the country was allowed to hold in her own hand. She crosses the highway on foot, live traffic, headlights, horns, blood on her face, in that soiled outfit, a black woman running across a Dallas freeway at night in 1976 with nothing. And she makes it to another hotel on the far side. She finds the manager, and she does something that tells you how far down she'd been pushed. She doesn't demand a room. She explains who she is, and she asks, she pleads, for a place to hide, and promises she'll find a way to pay. He lets her in. She checks in under another name and does not come out for days. That's it. That's the escape. No lawyer kicking down a door, no dramatic rescue, just an exhausted woman on the edge of a bed, waiting for a man to fall asleep, and then choosing the freeway over one more night. The behavior tells you everything the interviews can't. That's what real terror looks like when it finally decides it's done. Now, if a lot of that felt familiar to you, there's a reason, and it's a reason worth stopping on. Most of what the world thinks it knows about Ike and Tina Turner didn't come from either of them. It came from a movie, a 1993 film with two brilliant actors playing the leads that burned this marriage into the culture forever. Both of those actors got nominated for Academy Awards. It's a powerful film. It's also where a huge amount of the history people repeat actually comes from. Here's the problem. Both Turners disapproved of it. The film invented scenes that never happened, including a dramatic confrontation built for the screen. It smoothed over messy truths about the family, and Tina herself said, years later, that she tried to watch it and couldn't get through it, that it wasn't how things went. The dramatized version was easier to sell than the real one, so the dramatized version is the one that stuck. So when you picture this story, understand what you're picturing. Not a documentary, a movie. The real thing was quieter, longer, and in some ways worse, because there was no swelling music and no clean third act. There was just a woman with 36 cents, starting completely over at an age when the industry had already written her off. She filed for divorce that same summer, in July of 1976. It took until March of 1978 to become final, and when it did, she walked away with almost literally nothing. She gave up her share of the recording studio, the publishing, the real estate, the royalties, all of it. She kept 2 cars, a few personal things, and she kept her stage name. That was the deal she chose. She said it plainly. In the divorce, she got no money and no house, so she just took her name. On top of that, she inherited a pile of debt from canceled shows and a tax lien from the Internal Revenue Service following her around. She was in her late 30s. She was a solo act nobody was betting on. She was by every conventional measure finished. Remember the name? The one he built as a cage, registered as property, designed to trap her? She walked out of that marriage owning the one thing he'd made to own her, and she was about to turn it into something he could never have imagined. For years, it was hard. Small venues, television guest spots, cabaret rooms and hotel ballrooms, a legend playing to half-empty houses, paying off debt 1 gig at a time. And then, in 1984, at an age when female pop stars were supposed to disappear, she released a solo album that detonated. It gave her the single that became her signature, a cool, knowing, slightly wounded song about whether love is even worth the trouble. It went to #1, her only #1 as a solo artist in America. And at 44 years old, she became the oldest solo woman ever to top the American pop chart to that point. She won 3 Grammys in one night for it. The woman who'd left with 36 cents was suddenly, at an age most of the industry called over, the biggest comeback story on the planet. And then, because her story insists on rhyming, the movies came back too. In 1985, right on the heels of that comeback, she took the second great acting role of her life, a big, dusty, post-apocalyptic action film. And look at the part she plays this time. Not a trapped woman, not a drug dealer luring in the helpless. This time she plays the ruler, the absolute boss of a lawless city built out of the wreckage of the old world, a queen in the ruins, going toe-to-toe with the leading man, stealing every scene she's in. She won an Image Award from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People for it, and the theme songs spun right back out into more hits, welding her music and her acting together one more time. I don't think that casting was an accident, and I don't think it landed by luck. 10 years earlier, she played a woman caged inside a life she couldn't escape. Now free, she played a woman who'd survived the end of the world and sat on a throne she built out of the rubble. She didn't have to act that part. She'd lived it. She walked across a literal freeway to get there. And here's the twist that ties this whole thing together. The name. Ike Turner registered Tina Turner as a piece of property, so he'd never lose control of the woman wearing it. He turned her identity into a cage. And when the marriage finally shattered, that cage was the only thing she carried out the door, and she went and built an empire on it that dwarfed everything the two of them ever made together. Every record they sold as a duo, every stage they burned down, all of it. She outsold it, out-earned it, and outlived it, alone, on the strength of the one asset he thought made her his. He built a name to keep her small. She wore it to the top of the world. I wish I could tell you everyone got their happy ending. This is a tragedy. It doesn't do happy endings evenly. Ike Turner never really recovered. The cocaine that fueled the rise finally caught up with him. There were arrests through the late 80s. He went to prison, served around 17 months, and got out in the fall of 1991, which means that when Ike and Tina Turner were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that same year, one of the highest honors the business can give, Ike wasn't there. He was locked up. Two industry figures accepted the honor on the duo's behalf, and one of the greatest live acts in American history entered the Hall of Fame with one half in prison and the other half choosing, understandably, to stay away. To his credit, Ike did eventually stop blaming everyone else for the drugs, at least. He said, about the addiction, that what he did to himself. But he never fully reckoned with the rest of it in public. He died on December 12, 2007, at a home he was renting in Southern California. He was 76. The cause, per the medical examiner, was cocaine toxicity, an overdose, with heart and lung disease as contributing factors. The car song, the piano, the empire, the fear he built to keep from ever being powerless again. It ended with an overdose in a rented house. And the children carried their own weight. The son she'd had before Ike, whom Ike adopted and raised, took his own life in 2018. The one biological son she and Ike shared died of cancer in 2022. She outlived them both. Whatever she got in the end, it came stacked on top of grief most of us will never have to carry. As for Tina, she got the years she fought for. She built a life across the ocean, in Switzerland, with a man who by every account treated her the way she should have been treated all along. When her health began to fail, a stroke, cancer, kidneys giving out, that same man donated one of his own kidneys to keep her alive. That's the counterweight the universe finally handed her, decades late. Someone who gave her a piece of his own body instead of taking pieces of hers. In 2021, she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a second time, this time on her own, as a solo artist, one of only a small handful of women ever double inducted. In her recorded acceptance, past 80 years old, she said that if they were still handing her awards at that age, she must have done something right. She died on May 24th, 2023, at her home near Zurich, at 83 years old, after a long illness, surrounded by the life she'd built from 36 cents. So play that Riverboat song again. The slow part first, the tender part, the part that sounds like a love story, and then wait for the moment it catches fire. That's the whole marriage, right there in one song. The gentle open that the world fell for, and the roar underneath it that the world refused to hear until she was already running across a highway to get away from it. Here's the question I can't answer for you, and I've thought about it a lot. If a person is only allowed to become their fullest, freest, most powerful self after surviving something monstrous, Was the survival the making of them? Or was it just the thing they had to claw their way out of before the making could even begin? Would Tina Turner have been Tina Turner without Ike? Or did she become Tina Turner in spite of every single thing he did to stop her? I genuinely don't know. I'm not sure she did either. But I'll leave you with this. He spent his whole life terrified of being the man who didn't own the paper, so he made sure he owned her name. And in the end, the name was the one thing he couldn't hold on to, because she wore it out the door, across the freeway, and all the way to the top of a mountain he never got to climb. He owned the name on paper, she owned it on stage, and a stage always wins.